Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to review how to graph aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is one of my favorite parts of teaching principles of macro because this is sort of our payoff for everything we've done. It's all kind of been building to this moment where we're going to graph aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And so this is going to be our sort of big model in macroeconomics that helps us understand how the macroeconomy works, how different shocks to the economy might affect things, looking at things like unemployment, GDP and economic growth, and inflation and the price level are all going to be built into this model. This model includes long run and short run. It includes all these different dynamics. And as we get into this model, we're going to spend 3 chapters looking at this model from different perspectives and really reviewing it and diving deep into it. It's going to help us understand in the next level how fiscal and monetary policy can be used to alter this and try to manipulate the market. And then we can debate whether that's a good idea or not. So this is really exciting. I'm very excited. It's going to be in some ways similar to graphing supply and demand in a micro market, but it's also going to be completely different because we're looking at the aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Remembering that aggregate just means all the things added up together, right? So all of the demand in an economy and all of the supply in an economy. So let's get started. We want to start in a XY space where we've got similar to a traditional conventional market for goods and services, right? We would have a y-axis where we would have the price and an x-axis where we would have the quantity. But because now we're looking at aggregate supply and demand for the entire economy, we're not just going to look at prices. We're going to look at the overall price level for an economy. So all the prices. This is basically our measure of inflation. Does that kind of make sense? Like how high is the price level going for all the prices of goods and services, or how low? And then down here, we're not just going to have the quantity of a single good or service, but we're going to have our total measure of output for the whole economy. And we can see it labeled as output. Sometimes we'll see it just marked as Y, which is that total income or total productivity for a country. And some folks will even call it just straight up GDP, because that is our most common measure of output, although it's not our only one. The next step we want to do is graph aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And aggregate supply is, like I said, it's the supply of all of the goods and services in our economy. So it's based on our capacity, our ability to produce things, produce goods, produce services. It's going to be upward sloping because as the price level rises, we're going to expect output to rise. But it's going to have a different shape. It's going to have this kind of flat and then up shape because we're going to see the slope of aggregate supply be a function of different things. It's going to include the sort of long run and short run. So the way we're learning about aggregate supply right now, our total supply of output for our whole country, is it's going to be kind of flat here and then kind of hockey stick up here. And that's going to be our aggregate supply. And that's because of the relationship between the price level and our ability to produce goods and services. And that's where we'll get into this more in the next couple of chapters when we talk about Keynesian versus neoclassical views. But the idea is that there is a capacity that our economy has, right? We have a set number of labor, natural resources, physical capital, human capital, and there's a certain amount we can produce. And anywhere along here, we can produce more. Over here, we're underproducing, so we could do more without it raising costs. But when we get into this part here, now producing more is going to cost us more. Think about it as taking it down to like an individual level, right? If there are 24 hours in a day, if you're working 5 hours, 2 hours, you could do more. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. But as you get to pushing yourself further and further, you get to that sort of capacity of, okay, 8 hours, 10 hours, you're going to start feeling a higher cost for each additional hour of output. And when you get up here to where you're working maybe 20 hours, 18 hours, there's going to be a really high cost for just a little bit more productivity. It's the same thing with the country. We only have so many labor hours, so much capacity, so many factories, so many resources we can use. And so if we're underproducing, we can produce more with no effect on the price level. But when we get over here, producing more is going to be more costly, and we're going to see that reflected in the price level in the form of inflation, in the form of our economy running too hard, running too fast, cooking too much. And so that's going to be the idea. And so if you look on the textbook, you'll often see something where there's a line somewhere like this. That's sort of the potential GDP. And this potential GDP is based on the resources we have in the moment this year, right? The technology, the natural resources, the physical capital, the machines, the people we have in this year. This potential GDP is also associated with a natural rate of unemployment. And this comes from one of the biggest ideas in economics, which is just the idea that there's always a middle ground, right? We don't want to be at 100. We don't want to be at 0. We want to be right where we're comfortable. And that's at our sort of full capacity GDP, our natural rate of unemployment, our full capacity unemployment, our potential GDP area. It's where we are doing the most we can with what we have without getting into this very high cost area. So that's aggregate supply. It shows how this is about the maximum we can do with full employment of our workers and physical capital. We can push it higher, but it's going to come at a cost. It's like running an engine too hard, or running an animal too hard, or running yourself too hard, right? It's when I've been on my phone for too long and the battery starts to overheat. It's like, you should have stopped. Right around here was good. That's aggregate supply. Now we want to add in aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is the consumption of all those goods and services. And we're going to see something familiar here with aggregate demand. That's going to be the consumption, investment, government expenditure, and net exports that we saw when we talked about measuring GDP. And so aggregate demand is going to have all of those. It's going to be downward sloping because as prices go down, we're going to tend to buy more of everything. And so when all prices go down, we'll buy more of everything. And when all prices go up, we'll buy less. So we're going to see aggregate demand be generally downward sloping like that. Not as interesting as aggregate supply. But what is interesting here is that aggregate demand, oops, that's kind of a weird way to do that, is the summation of the consumption of all of a country's goods and services produced within a period. So when we talk about aggregate demand in the US, we're talking about all of the goods and services that are produced within the country within a month or within a year, and we can break them down into who they are consumed by. Do I have a little blue card? I don't know. So we can think about this being y equals c plus I plus g plus nx. And that's going to be important because that's going to help us understand the factors that shift aggregate demand. So in equilibrium, we have aggregate demand, we have aggregate supply, we have some potential, right, level of full employment potential GDP. Put that up there in light color though, because it's not the most important thing. It's not going to play out too much. But the idea here is that we have an equilibrium at this point. We have an equilibrium level of productivity. That's going to be our GDP at that time, right? We might call that Y star. It's our level of GDP in equilibrium. And then we're going to have an equilibrium price level. and we can call that PL if you want, if you don't like doing a lot of writing, but it's going to give you some kind of equilibrium rate of inflation or level of prices in that economy. So this gives us now our model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And we can kind of graph this generally. There's a lot of examples of it in your textbook and in the slides. You can go online and just look up aggregate demand and aggregate supply curves, and you'll see some versions of this and some variations of it that we'll get into later. But that's the basic idea. The next thing we want to do is we want to start to play with this model, because the whole point of looking at this model and using it is to try and understand how shocks to the economy will affect unemployment, GDP, and inflation. So first of all, we can see a couple of things. We see inflation is over here, right? This is, I'll mark these in green. This is where we measure inflation. And we measure GDP here. Where's unemployment? I promised you unemployment. Unemployment is going to be counter-cyclical. It's going to be the opposite of GDP. So we're going to see unemployment be down here too. And this isn't perfect, but it's common enough that economists are pretty comfortable with it. So when GDP is going up, unemployment's going down. When GDP is going down, unemployment is going up. So it's going to show up down here on the x-axis. Even though it's not labeled, we can always assume that when GDP is rising, unemployment is dropping, and vice versa. For standard economic analysis, for our purposes in this class. If you want to get a deeper dive, you're going to have to take more macro, my friends. So that's kind of where everything lives. Now let's talk about what would shift this model. So I'm going to go ahead and erase my little green notes here, and I'm going to start putting in some shocks to the economy. The first thing we're going to do is we are going to have a recession. Straightforward, easy peasy. Part A, what happens if there's a recession? Well, first of all, we know what a recession is. A recession is a period of economic contraction, right? The economy is getting smaller, GDP is going down. We might see the price level go down. We'll see unemployment go up. One thing we know that happens when there's a recession is we're going to see consumers buy less. So I'm going to get a little indicator there. We're going to see C go down. Firms invest less. And depending, we might see net exports change too, especially if we're thinking about a big recession like the COVID-19 pandemic or the Great Recession. That affected not just consumption and investment, but also other countries were affected by those same factors. And so they bought fewer of our exports. So that affected net exports too. So those factors are going to reduce GDP, and that's going to result in a shift inward of aggregate demand. So we're going to try and keep the shape the same, and I'm going to say AD has shifted in. So that's going to be aggregate demand A. I'm going to mark it down here. Aggregate demand would shift in to the left. Now we want to find our new equilibrium. The question on your graphing problem asks what would happen to the price level, what would happen to output, and what would happen to unemployment. So we can find the new price level here. We're going to expect the price level to go down. We're going to expect GDP to go down. And if we see a decrease in the price level and a decrease in GDP, we're also going to expect an increase in unemployment. Just because there is no longer going to be as many jobs available, right? If consumption is shrinking, if investment spending is shrinking, then firms are going to be closing up shop. Lower incomes mean households buy fewer things, means stores have fewer hours, means they lay people off. It cascades through the economy, right? So we're going to expect a recession to shift aggregate demand in to the left, reducing the price and reducing GDP while increasing unemployment. So that's what we're going to see be the effect of a recession. That's how it's going to impact the economy, and it's all contained in one graph. I'm excited. I hope you're excited too. So That is what happens when there's a recession. Now we're going to play around with some other things. Let's see what happens when we do other stuff. So I'm going to erase my little arrows from all of this, and we are going to continue to look at what happens with this model. The next one is part B, says graph the effect of warmer weather making people feel happier, leading to increased consumer confidence. And I'm going to go ahead and erase this purple curve here, but I'm going to keep the answer down here on the bottom just as a reference point. But what we're going to see is that consumer confidence. Well, what is consumer confidence? It's actually kind of funny and weird because it's very hokey the way it's done. But consumer confidence is just how people feel about the economy. And the idea is that when people feel good, when they are confident, when they think that things are going well or things are going to get better, then they're going to be much happier to spend money. So consumer confidence is going to affect this guy right here. When consumer confidence goes up, consumption goes up. So let's write that down here. B is going to be increased consumer confidence. Well, that's going to increase consumption spending. And when consumption spending increases, aggregate demand is going to shift out to a higher level. So we'll call that ADB. That shift out of aggregate demand is going to give us the opposite of what we saw last time. So last time the recession, reduced consumption, reduced investment led to lower prices, lower GDP, and higher unemployment. Now, higher consumer confidence is going to increase consumption spending, shifting aggregate demand out, which is going to lead to higher price level, higher GDP, and lower unemployment. And we can see that right here. The new equilibrium point is going to give us a higher price level and a higher rate of GDP. And when GDP goes up, we are going to see unemployment go down. The economy's stronger. People feel good. They're going out. They're making purchases. Firms are saying, wow, we're doing great. We should hire more people. Those people get hired. They make money. They go out and spend it. It's a virtuous cycle. It feeds itself and it grows our economy. But as we move up higher and higher, too much aggregate demand can be problematic, right? If we get too high, our economy can start churning too fast. That's going to raise prices. So again, it's all about middle ground. It's all about finding this sort of steady state cruise control place in the economy. So those are two big obvious outcomes. What about part C? Part C says, what happens if longer, colder winters decrease farming yields in the Midwest? That's going to be not an aggregate demand effect. Part C, colder winters and lower farming yields, that's going to affect our ability to produce goods and services. That's going to affect our supply of food, and that's going to affect our aggregate supply. So now we're finally going to get to shift that aggregate supply curve. What we're going to see is that this decrease in productivity, right? That's going to be decreased productivity, is going to result in an inward shift in aggregate supply. So it's going to look something like this. Aggregate supply shifts in to the left, right? Not up or down, because it'll get really confusing here, right? Aggregate supply shifts in to the left to a lower level. And I'm going to go ahead and get rid of our old aggregate demand from part B. And what we'll see here is now GDP has changed again, the price level has changed again, and we're going to expect unemployment to have changed again. Our new equilibrium is going to be a point where GDP is lower and prices are higher. So we have a higher price level, lower GDP, and we're going to expect unemployment. right? So that's going to mean higher prices because there's less stuff to go around, lower GDP because we're producing less, right? We're literally producing fewer crops because crop yields are down, and that's going to lead to some unemployment, specifically in that industry, right? We're going to have fewer people harvesting fewer crops, but it's also going to mean that lower GDP is going to start to hit families, hit other secondary markets, third level markets, tertiary markets, and that's going to restrict the economy a little bit, make us take a hit. So that is the effect of reduced yields. And so this is how you want to think about it. Is it something that's going to show up as consumption spending, investment spending, government spending, or net exports? Or is it something that's going to affect the entire country's capacity and ability to produce goods and services? That's how we figure out which curve we shift. So is it affecting our ability to produce goods and services or our consumption of them, either as consumers, firms, the government, or other countries? And then after we figure out whether it's demand or supply, we figure out if we're shifting out to a higher level or in to a lower level. So we have one more problem. I bet you could guess that it's going to be a little bit of the one step we haven't done yet, a change in aggregate supply that grows it. But let's see what our example is, because you know me, I love a fun, silly, insane example. So I believe this one is, yes, newly elected President Beyonce is lowering taxes for all Americans. What would that do to the economy? Let's see, do I have another color here? We'll use this color. Okay, so now we've got, oh, it's gonna look really similar. We'll use, sorry y'all, I'm running out of colors. Part D, this is gonna be a little bit more interesting. This is going to get us into the next stage of things that we're going to see when we get around to next chapter, the next couple of chapters. But if we see taxes go down, that's going to affect consumption. We'll talk about it more later on, but the idea is when you make money, some of it goes to taxes. If your taxes get lower, you have more money and you'll spend it on stuff, which is great. So if we lower taxes, we'll see consumption go up. That's going to shift aggregate demand out, just like we saw in Part B. If aggregate demand shifts out, we're going to see the price level increase, we're going to see GDP increase, and we're going to see a decrease in unemployment. Everybody's happy. This is one of the ways that we can try to improve the economy. If we can lower taxes and get people to spend more money, that will mean they buy more stuff, and buying more stuff pushes that economy out. Make sense? I'm going to graph one more for you. I know I didn't graph Part D. It's just the same as Part B, right? It's another shift out of aggregate demand. But the last one we want to do, Part E, is going to be when we see aggregate supply shift out. And my favorite example of this is computers. We have seen so much growth in the productivity of computers. So new tech makes computers cheaper and more productive, right? So new technology emerges, it makes computers twice as powerful and half the price. That's going to make us more efficient. It's going to mean we can produce more goods and services with the labor and the natural resources and the capital we already have. So new tech is going to increase our productivity and shift aggregate supply out. And this is awesome because now what we would see is this potential GDP line is going to shift out too. When our long run ability to produce everything increases, we can produce more. And this doesn't happen easily. It happens a lot of the time with technology. It'll happen when there's a new innovation. It might happen when we find a new natural resource. If we discovered oil under the mountains of Placer County, it might happen if we have a new innovation in technology. It might happen if we grow our labor supply or increase investment in education. Those things are going to increase our capacity. If we have a tax policy that subsidizes building new companies, that would do it too. But what we're going to see is aggregate supply is going to shift out, and we're going to get a new higher level of GDPE, and the price level's going to go down. Things are going to get cheaper, and we're going to have more of them, and we're going to have lower unemployment. So when we grow our economy with aggregate supply, we're really happy. That's really good news because it gives us the best of all possible worlds, right? Lower price level, higher GDP, and lower unemployment. It can be hard to grow your capacity, your ability to produce everything, but it has really good consequences for the economy. And like I said, what you'd see then is this steady state level of potential GDP would move out to a higher level because our capacity has increased. Does that make sense? So that's what the whole point of this assignment is, looking at aggregate demand and aggregate supply. How do we graph it? How do we interpret it? And when something happens to the economy, what are the outcomes and how do we model it so we can understand, oh wow, there's a massive flood. What is that going to do to our ability to produce goods and services, maybe even our consumption of stuff? And how is that going to affect the economy at large in terms of our main three indicators, inflation, unemployment, and GDP productivity? So let me know what questions you have, and I'll see you next time.